In the autumn of 1978, a small village nestled in the rolling hills of Wales became the epicenter of one of the most baffling mysteries ever recorded. A tale so chilling that even now, decades later, its echoes refuse to fade. This is the story of two twins, Rhys and Elund Evans, who vanished without a trace after speaking a language no one had ever taught them. The village of Lan Fair Pewol Gwyngal, known for its impossibly long name and picturesque landscapes, was once a quiet haven, untouched by modern chaos. But all of that changed on October 14, 1978. It began with whispers among the villagers, rumors of strange occurrences near the old farmhouse perched atop Blackthorn Hill. The house belonged to the Evans family, a modest household led by Thomas and Margaret Evans, devout Christians whose lives revolved around their faith and their children. Rhys and Elund were inseparable, their bond closer than any sibling relationship anyone had seen before. They shared secrets, whispered under moonlit skies, played games understood only by themselves and seemed to communicate without words. Their laughter filled the valley during daylight hours, but as dusk fell, their presence grew quieter, almost spectral. Neighbors often remarked how the twins would sit together under the ancient oak tree outside their home, staring into the distance as if listening to something far away. But then came the night when everything changed. On October 13th, the eve of their disappearance, the twins were spotted wandering through the woods near Blackthorn Hill. Several villagers reported hearing an eerie chant carried by the wind, a melody neither Welsh nor English, yet hauntingly rhythmic. When questioned about it the next morning, Rhys and Elund claimed they didn't remember leaving the house, yet their eyes betrayed them. There was a glint of something unfamiliar, something otherworldly lurking beneath their innocent faces. That evening, the Evans family gathered for dinner. The meal passed in relative silence, broken only by the occasional clink of cutlery against porcelain. Afterward, the twins excused themselves early, retreating upstairs to their shared bedroom. By midnight, their parents realized neither child could be found. Panic spread quickly as search parties scoured the surrounding countryside, calling out their names into the darkness. Hours turned into days, but no trace of Rhys and Elund was discovered, not a single footprint, hair, or scrap of clothing. What followed was a media frenzy. Reporters descended upon the tiny village, desperate to uncover answers. Psychics, linguists, and paranormal investigators joined the hunt, each offering theories wilder than the last. Some believed the twins had been abducted by cults practicing forbidden rituals. Others speculated alien abduction or government experiments gone awry, but none could explain the most perplexing detail. Recordings captured during the search revealed fragments of the mysterious language the twins had supposedly spoken, a tongue that defied classification. As weeks stretched into months, hope dwindled. The case grew cold, though whispers continued to circulate among locals. Stories emerged of ghostly figures seen near Blackthorn Hill, their forms translucent and fleeting. Children playing nearby swore they heard giggles echoing through the trees, accompanied by snippets of that same unearthly dialect. Parents warned their kids never to venture too close to the hill, fearful of what might await those who trespassed. Yet amidst the fear and speculation, questions lingered. Who or what had taken Rhys and Elund? Why had they begun speaking a language unknown to humanity? And perhaps most terrifying of all, were they still alive? To understand this enigma, we must delve deeper into the history of Blackthorn Hill, a place steeped in legend and superstition. Long before the Evans, families settled there. Tales of strange happenings circulated among the villagers. Locals spoke of shadowy figures moving between the trees, of disembodied voices singing hymns in languages long forgotten. Archaeological digs conducted in the early 20th century uncovered artifacts suggesting the hill had once been a sacred site for druidic rituals. Could these ancient practices have awakened forces beyond comprehension? By exploring the past, piecing together eyewitness accounts and revisiting the evidence left behind, we begin to unravel the threads of this unspeakable mystery. But beware. Some truths are better left buried. For every step closer to understanding, another door creaks open, one leading not to clarity but to madness. And so, our journey begins. Not merely to solve the riddle of the missing twins, but to confront the darkness that lies dormant beneath the soil of Blackthorn Hill. Stay with me as we descend into the heart of this chilling tale, where reality blurs with nightmare, and the line between life and death becomes perilously thin. The disappearance of Reese and Elund Evans was not sudden. It began with whispers. In the weeks leading up to October 14, 1978, villagers noticed an unsettling change in the twins. Their laughter, once bright and carefree, grew quieter, more subdued. They were often seen sitting under the ancient oak tree near Blackthorn Hill, their heads bowed together as though engaged in a private conversation. But here's the strangest part. No one could hear them speak. At first, neighbors dismissed it as childish secrecy, assuming the twins had invented some secret code or game. However, when school teachers reported that Reese and Elund had stopped participating in class discussions entirely, concern began to spread. They sit quietly at their desks, one teacher told Margaret Evans during a parent-teacher meeting. But they seem distant, like they're listening to something we can't hear. Margaret brushed off the comments, attributing her children's behavior to grief over the recent loss of their pet dog. Yet deep down, she felt uneasy. She couldn't explain why, but there was something unnatural about the way the twins carried themselves, like shadows stretched too thin across the earth. Then came the night everything changed. On October 13th, the eve of their disappearance, several villagers reported hearing an eerie chant carried by the wind from the direction of Blackthorn Hill. It wasn't Welsh, nor English, nor any recognizable tongue. Instead, it sounded like a melody woven from fragments of forgotten languages, oi, haunting rhythm punctuated by sharp guttural syllables. Those who heard it swore the sound seemed to emanate from multiple voices, layered atop one another, creating a dissonance that made their skin crawl. When questioned the next morning, Reese and Elund claimed they didn't remember leaving the house. Yet their clothes bore traces of damp soil and their eyes gleamed with an otherworldly calm. Thomas Evans, their father, demanded answers, but the twins simply stared back, silent and unyielding. That evening, the family gathered for dinner. The meal passed in relative silence, broken only by the clinking of utensils against plates. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows and sending shivers down Margaret's spine. As dessert was served, she glanced at her children and froze. Reese and Elund sat motionless, their faces pale, their lips moving in perfect synchronization, but no sound escaped their mouths. "Children?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling. "What are you doing?" Reese turned to her slowly, his expression blank. "We're practicing," he said softly. "Practicing what?" Thomas barked, slamming his fist on the table. Elund tilted her head, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the walls of the house. "The words," she whispered. "The ones they gave us." Before their parents could respond, the twins rose from the table and excused themselves, retreating upstairs without another word. By midnight, neither child could be found. Panic spread quickly as search parties scoured the surrounding countryside, calling out their names into the darkness. Hours turned into days, but no trace of Reese and Elund was discovered. Not a single footprint, hair, or scrap of clothing. The only clue left behind was a notebook filled with strange symbols and phrases scribbled in ink, so faded it appeared almost spectral. As weeks stretched into months, hope dwindled. The case grew cold, though rumors continued to circulate among locals. Children playing nearby swore they heard giggles echoing through the trees, accompanied by snippets of that same unearthly dialect. Parents warned their kids never to venture too close to Blackthorn Hill, fearful of what might await those who trespassed. But amidst the fear and speculation, questions lingered. Who, or what, had taught the twins their mysterious language? Why had they begun speaking it in the first place? And perhaps most terrifying of all, were they still alive? To understand this enigma, we must delve deeper into the history of Blackthorn Hill, a place steeped in legend and superstition. Long before the Evans family settled there, tales of strange happenings circulated among the villagers. Locals spoke of shadowy figures moving between the trees, of disembodied voices singing hymns in languages long forgotten. Archaeological digs conducted in the early 20th century uncovered artifacts suggesting the hill had once been a sacred site for druidic rituals. Could these ancient practices have awakened forces beyond comprehension? By exploring the past, piecing together eyewitness accounts and revisiting the evidence left behind, we begin to unravel the threads of this unspeakable mystery. But beware. Some truths are better left buried. For every step closer to understanding, another door creaks open, one leading not to clarity but to madness. The weeks following Reese and Alund Evans' disappearance were marked by an unsettling stillness that blanketed the village of Llanfairpwllgwyngyll. The once bustling streets grew quieter, as if the townsfolk feared attracting attention to themselves, or worse, invoking whatever force had claimed the twins. Yet beneath this silence lay a simmering undercurrent of fear and speculation. Whispers circulated about the strange language the twins had spoken, a dialect no one could identify or explain. It was as though the very air carried fragments of their voices, lingering like echoes in the minds of those who had heard them. Margaret and Thomas Evans, devastated by the loss of their children, became reclusive. They refused to speak to reporters or investigators, choosing instead to lock themselves away in their farmhouse at the edge of Blackthorn Hill. Neighbors reported seeing lights burning late into the night, casting eerie shadows against the curtains. Some claimed to hear faint chanting emanating from within the house, though none dared approach to investigate further. The Evans family, already shrouded in mystery, now seemed consumed by it. For Sarah Monroe, a young linguistics researcher, drawn to Wales by the baffling case of the twins, the mystery proved irresistible. Armed with notebooks, recording equipment, and an insatiable curiosity, she arrived in the village determined to uncover the truth. Her initial inquiries yielded little beyond hushed rumors and reluctant admissions. They spoke something unnatural, one elderly villager confided, his voice trembling. Not Welsh, not English, not anything I've ever heard before. Sarah's first visit to Blackthorn Hill left her deeply unsettled. The hill itself seemed alive, its gnarled trees twisting toward the sky like skeletal fingers. As she approached the abandoned farmhouse, the temperature dropped sharply, and an inexplicable heaviness settled over her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, though there was no one in sight. Inside the house, the air smelled of damp earth and decay, and faint symbols etched into the walls glowed faintly in the dim light. It was here, amidst the ruins of the Evans home, that Sarah discovered a notebook filled with cryptic writings, fragments of the twins' mysterious language. Back in her rented room at the local inn, Sarah pored over the notebook, attempting to decipher its contents. The symbols bore no resemblance to any known writing system, yet they possessed a rhythmic quality, almost musical in nature. Phrases repeated themselves, layered upon one another in ways that defied logic. Sarah recorded herself reading aloud, hoping to detect patterns or meanings, but each attempt sent chills down her spine. The words felt wrong, as if speaking them aloud awakened something dormant within her. Her obsession deepened when she began experiencing vivid dreams. In these dreams, she stood at the edge of Blackthorn Hill, surrounded by shadowy figures who whispered in the twins' language. Their voices overlapped, creating a dissonant harmony that resonated in her mind long after waking. During one particularly harrowing dream, Reese and Alund appeared before her, their faces pale and hollow-eyed. "We are waiting," they said in unison, their voices echoing unnaturally. "Come find us." Determined to unravel the mystery, Sarah sought out others who might shed light on the twins' disappearance. She interviewed teachers, neighbors, and even distant relatives of the Evans family, piecing together a fragmented portrait of the twins' lives leading up to their vanishing. What emerged was a chilling pattern. In the months prior to their disappearance, Reese and Alund had grown increasingly withdrawn, spending hours alone in the woods near Blackthorn Hill. Villagers reported hearing laughter and singing emanating from the forest, only to find no trace of the twins when they investigated. Others claimed to have seen ghostly figures moving among the trees, their forms flickering like candle flames. One evening, while reviewing her notes, Sarah stumbled upon a startling revelation. Buried in local archives was a series of newspaper clippings dating back nearly 50 years, detailing similar cases of disappearances linked to Blackthorn Hill. Each account described individuals, often children, who vanished without explanation, leaving behind only faint traces of their presence. In every instance, witnesses reported hearing strange chants or melodies in languages unknown to them. The parallels were undeniable. The twins' case was not an isolated incident, but part of a much larger, darker pattern. Driven by this discovery, Sarah returned to Blackthorn Hill, desperate for answers. This time, she ventured deeper into the woods, ignoring the warnings of villagers who urged her to stay away. As dusk fell, the forest transformed into a labyrinth of shadows and whispers. Every step felt heavier, as though the ground resisted her presence. Then she saw it. A clearing surrounded by ancient oak trees, their branches interwoven to form a natural dome. At the center of the clearing stood a stone altar, its surface etched with the same symbols she had found in the Evans farmhouse. Kneeling beside the altar, Sarah noticed faint traces of dried blood and ash. Nearby, half buried in the soil, lay a small leather-bound book. Its pages were brittle with age, but the text inside matched the twins' notebook exactly. As she flipped through the book, a sudden gust of wind extinguished her lantern, plunging the clearing into darkness. Panic set in as the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. Shadows converged around her, taking shape as humanoid figures with hollow eyes and elongated limbs. They reached for her, their hands passing through her body like smoke. When Sarah awoke hours later, she was lying at the edge of the woods, the book clutched tightly in her hands. Her clothes were torn, her skin scratched and bruised, yet she had no memory of how she had escaped the clearing. The experience left her shaken, but resolute. She realized then that the twins' language was not merely a code or cipher. It was a key, unlocking doors best left closed, and she had unwittingly turned it. Returning to the village, Sarah shared her findings with Daniel Graves, a historian specializing in folklore and occult practices. Together they analyzed the symbols and phrases, discovering references to ancient druidic rituals believed to summon spirits or commune with the dead. According to legend, Blackthorn Hill had once been a sacred site where such rituals were performed, binding the living to the deceased in ways that defied comprehension. The twins, it seemed, had tapped into this forgotten power, becoming conduits for forces far beyond their understanding. As Sarah delved deeper into the mystery, she began noticing subtle changes in herself. Her reflection in mirrors appeared, distorted, her features stretched and unfamiliar. Objects in her room moved inexplicably, and faint symbols began appearing on her skin overnight, glowing faintly in the dark. The whispers followed her everywhere, growing louder and more coherent. "You are chosen," they murmured. "Join us." Despite her growing unease, Sarah pressed on, convinced that solving the puzzle would bring closure to the tragedy. She and Daniel devised a plan to perform a counter-ritual, using fire, salt, and protective symbols to sever the connection between the twins and the spirits haunting Blackthorn Hill. On the night of the ritual, they returned to the clearing, braving the oppressive atmosphere and the watchful eyes of unseen entities. As Sarah recited the incantation, the ground trembled and the air crackled with energy. Shadows writhed and screamed, resisting the disruption of their bond. Then, abruptly, silence. The forest stilled, the oppressive weight lifting as suddenly as it had descended. For a moment, Sarah dared to hope that the curse had been broken, but as she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of movement in the trees. Two figures stood side by side, their faces pale and ethereal. Reese and Elund smiled faintly, their lips moving in perfect synchronization. Though no sound escaped their mouths, Sarah understood their message clearly. This is not the end. The days following Sarah Monroe's harrowing ritual at Hollow Hill were a blur of exhaustion and unease. She had survived, barely, but the victory felt hollow, like grasping at smoke that slipped through her fingers no matter how tightly she clenched her fists. The spirits seemed subdued. Their oppressive weight lifted from the estate, yet Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something lingered. It wasn't just paranoia. It was an instinctual certainty, a gnawing awareness that the Halberts' influence hadn't been eradicated, it had merely shifted. Her apartment became a battleground between normalcy and the supernatural. By day, Sarah meticulously documented her findings, cataloging every detail of the rituals, symbols, and artifacts tied to the Halberts. But by night, the shadows thickened, pressing closer to the walls, whispering faintly in languages she almost recognized but could never fully understand. Every sound, the creak of a floorboard, the sigh of the wind, the distant howl of a dog, became a potential message, a reminder that Hollow Hill was not finished with her. The house, the cellar, the spirits, they were all a part of her now, and she a part of them. Sleep brought no relief. Dreams became endless corridors of the Halbert estate, winding infinitely, each door leading to new horrors. In one recurring vision, she stood in the cellar, surrounded by jars lining the walls. Each jar contained fragments of lives snatched away, locks of hair, fingers, hearts suspended in murky liquid. The air smelled of decay and damp earth, and faint symbols glowed on the stone walls, pulsing in time with her heartbeat. Behind her, Lydia Halbert appeared, her form flickering like candlelight, her hollow eyes accusing and commanding. "You cannot escape," Lydia whispered, her voice layered with centuries of sorrow and rage. "You are ours now." Sarah awoke, drenched in sweat, often finding faint scratches along her arms, symbols carved as if by invisible fingernails. These marks faded by morning, leaving only raised welts, but their presence was undeniable. They served as reminders that the bond between her and the Halberts remained unbroken. Knowledge and proximity had made her one of them, a living conduit for their lingering darkness. Daniel Graves noticed the change almost immediately. He had seen obsession before, but this was different. Haunted in the truest sense, as if the house itself had transferred its curse to Sarah. "Sarah," he said cautiously during one of their late-night research sessions, "you can't do this alone. You're already too deep. We need to finish what we started properly this time." She nodded, knowing he was right. The rituals she had performed in the cellar had weakened the tether but had not severed it. The spirits of the Halberts, bound by blood, ritual, and vengeance, still lingered. Their power persisted not only in the estate but within her. And now, she realized with growing terror, she was part of the Halbert lineage in every way that mattered. Knowledge and proximity had made her one of them. Together they pored over the notes Sarah had painstakingly gathered from the cellar and the blackened book. Every ritual, every symbol, every fragment of history pointed to a single truth. The Halberts had created a nexus, a bridge between the living and the dead, and the only way to truly end it was to destroy that bridge entirely. The mass graves, the tunnels beneath Hollow Hill, and the estate itself were all connected, forming a lattice that anchored the spirits. Destroy the nexus, and the spirits might finally find peace, or rage beyond comprehension. Their plan was desperate, audacious, and dangerous. They would return to Hollow Hill with fire, salt, and sacred artifacts designed to disrupt the rituals. They would dismantle the tunnels, burn the books, and break every jar, every vessel containing the fragments of the dead. They knew the spirits would resist, that the Halberts' influence would fight back with every ounce of their malevolent power. But it was the only chance they had. The night they returned, a storm raged over Hollow Hill. Lightning split the sky, thunder rolling across the hills like the echo of ancient screams. The estate, silhouetted against the lightning, looked alive, almost sentient. Windows seemed to glimmer with eyes, and the wind carried faint whispers, calling names, promising, secrets threatening reprisal. Sarah felt it in her bones. The house knew they were coming. Inside, the air was thick with the familiar stench of decay and ritual. The cellar stairs yawned before them like a mouth, black and endless. Every step down felt like a descent into another world, one layered with centuries of pain, obsession, and cruelty. Shadows moved in the corners of her vision, coalescing into forms she knew she had faced before. But now they were larger, more terrifying. The spirits had grown restless. At the pedestal, Sarah placed the remnants of her protective circles, drawing symbols in salt and chalk. She lit candles, their flames dancing in defiance of the oppressive darkness. The blackened book, which had haunted her dreams for months, rested once again on the pedestal. She opened it, not with curiosity but with resolve, and began to recite the incantation that she and Daniel had modified, an invocation meant to sever ties, release souls, and disrupt centuries of accumulated malevolence. The cellar responded, immediately. Shadows writhed violently, screaming, chanting, and crying simultaneously. The air grew suffocating, as though the house itself were trying to choke the life from them. The jars trembled, some falling to the floor and shattering with a sound that was half glass, half bone. Fragments of the halbert's victims seemed to rise in the air, spinning in a furious vortex of light and darkness. Then Lydia appeared, her form more solid than ever, her eyes burning with a mixture of rage and sorrow. "You think you can undo what has been done?" she demanded. "The family's work cannot be destroyed by fire or blood alone. We endure." Sarah met her gaze, trembling but unwavering. "We can end it," she said. "You and the others deserve rest. But you'll never have peace if you remain bound. Here." A scream tore through the cellar, echoing in every corner from every wall. The spirits surged forward, a mass of shadows, screams, and cold. Sarah and Daniel clutched each other and the blackened book, pouring the salt and their own blood into the flames. The fire roared, green and unnatural, consuming the book, the pedestal, and some of the jars. Shadows shrieked and recoiled, thrashing as the connection began to fracture. The vortex reached its peak, and then, a silence so absolute it burned in their ears. Smoke cleared, shadows dissipated, and the cellar felt impossibly still. Sarah collapsed, tears streaking her face, every nerve aching. For the first time, she sensed absence, the absence of the suffocating presence that had haunted her nights and dreams. The spirits had been freed, or at least dispersed, though the cost was still unknown. As they emerged into the storm-soaked night, the estate seemed smaller, quieter, less alive. But Sarah knew, in a place deep inside her, that some remnants would remain. Some whispers, some echoes, some fragments of the halbert's legacy would never leave. She had survived, and the immediate threat had been subdued. But the darkness had left its mark, and its vigilance was eternal. The storm that raged over Hollow Hill on the night of Sarah Monroe's final confrontation felt alive. Its winds, howling like ancient voices, its lightning slicing through the sky with surgical precision, the estate loomed before them, jagged and skeletal against the chaos of nature, as if it were a creature waiting to devour anyone foolish enough to approach. Sarah stood at the edge of the property, her breath shallow, her hands trembling despite the resolve burning in her chest. Beside her, Daniel Graves clutched a lantern, his face pale but determined. They had prepared for this moment meticulously, yet neither could shake the feeling that they were walking into something far greater than themselves. "Are you ready?" Daniel asked, his voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. Sarah nodded, though she wasn't sure she truly was. She had survived the rituals, faced Lydia Halbert, and endured countless sleepless nights, haunted by whispers and shadows. But this was different. This was the culmination of everything she had uncovered, every sacrifice made, every truth unearthed. If they failed tonight, there would be no second chances. The ruins of the farmhouse were slick with rain, the ground unstable beneath their feet. As they stepped inside, the air grew heavier, pressing down on them like an invisible weight. The walls groaned under the force of the wind, and faint symbols etched into the decaying wood seemed to glow faintly, reacting to Sarah's presence. It was as if the house remembered her, recognized her, and was warning her not to proceed further. But there was no turning back now. They descended into the cellar, each step echoing ominously in the cavernous space. The room stretched unnaturally, its dimensions distorted by the oppressive energy that saturated the air. Shadows writhed along the walls, coalescing into indistinct forms that watched silently, hungrily. At the center of the room stood the remnants of the pedestal where the blackened book had once rested. Though destroyed months ago, its absence left a void, a palpable emptiness that seemed to pulse with malevolent intent. Sarah placed the mirror they had brought onto the pedestal, its surface shimmering faintly in the dim light. Around it, she traced a circle of salt, embedding fragments of protective herbs and personal belongings from victims of the Halbert's rituals. Each item carried a piece of history, a fragment of memory meant to anchor the spirits to this plane, long enough for the ritual to work. Finally, she poured a vial of her own blood onto the ground, completing the triad of fire, salt, and blood required to sever the connection. As she lit the candles surrounding the circle, the room erupted into motion. Shadows surged forward, twisting and contorting into grotesque shapes. Whispers filled the air, overlapping and discordant, rising to a deafening crescendo. Figures began to emerge from the darkness, faces twisted in anguish, eyes hollow yet aware. Among them, Lydia Halbert materialized, her form more solid than ever, her gaze piercing and accusatory. "You cannot undo what has been done," Lydia hissed, her voice layered with centuries of sorrow and rage. "The family's legacy is eternal. Blood remembers." Sarah met her gaze, trembling but resolute. "I'm not trying to undo your past," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "I'm giving you a chance to leave it behind, to find peace." Lydia's expression flickered, uncertainty flashing across her spectral features. For a moment, the cacophony of voices quieted, replaced by a single haunting melody, a chant that resonated deep within Sarah's soul. It was the language of the Halberts, the untraceable dialect spoken by Ezekiel, Caleb, and Thomas, passed down through generations. And now, Sarah understood it. With the mirror reflecting her image, and the countless spirits lingering behind her, Sarah began the incantation. Her voice trembled at first, but as she continued, it grew stronger, layered, with the echoes of those who had come before her. The words carried power, weaving together threads of acknowledgement, renunciation, and release. Each syllable seemed to tear at the fabric of reality, unraveling the bonds that had tethered the living to the dead for nearly 2 centuries. The shadows recoiled, shrieking and writhing as the ritual progressed. The ground shook violently, sending debris tumbling from the ceiling. Candles flickered wildly, their flames bending toward the vortex forming at the center of the circle. The mirror rippled like water, distorting Sarah's reflection until it no longer resembled her. Instead, she saw faces, hundreds of them stacked atop one another, their eyes pleading, accusing, forgiving. Daniel held his ground beside her, clutching the lantern tightly. His lips moved in silent prayer, his faith bolstering their fragile barrier against the supernatural forces threatening to overwhelm them. "Keep going," he urged, his voice strained but unwavering. "You're almost there." As Sarah reached the climax of the incantation, the room erupted into chaos. Lightning struck directly above the estate, illuminating the cellar in stark relief. The spirits surged forward, their forms stretching impossibly, reaching for her with clawed hands. Lydia's voice rose above the din, a mixture of fury and desperation. "You cannot sever what has been woven. You are part of us now." Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she spoke the final words, her voice breaking with emotion. "I acknowledge your pain. I honor your suffering. And I release you." For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Then with a deafening roar, the vortex collapsed inward, consuming the shadows, the whispers, and the spirits in a blinding flash of green light. The mirror shattered, its shards scattering across the floor like fallen stars. The air vibrated, with energy then stilled, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. When Sarah opened her eyes, she found herself lying on the cold, damp floor of the cellar. Daniel knelt beside her, his face pale but relieved. The oppressive weight that had lingered for so long was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of emptiness. The estate felt lighter, quieter, almost peaceful. They emerged into the storm-soaked night, the wind dying down as if the land itself were exhaling. The silhouette of the ruined farmhouse stood against the horizon, smaller and less menacing than before. Sarah stared at it, tears streaming down her face. She had done it. The nexus had been broken. The Halberts' legacy, while not erased, had been severed, at least for now. But as they walked away from Hollow Hill, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something remained. Not a shadow, not a whisper, but a faint hum beneath her skin, a reminder that some connections could never fully be undone. Blood called to blood, and Sarah knew deep down that the Halbert story was not entirely finished. The storm that had raged over Hollow Hill during Sarah Monroe's final ritual dissipated as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind an eerie stillness. The air, once thick with whispers and shadows, now felt hollow, emptied of the oppressive weight that had lingered for nearly 2 centuries. Yet as Sarah stood amidst the ruins of the Halbert estate, her body trembling from exhaustion and relief, she couldn't shake the feeling that something remained. It wasn't a sound or a presence, it was more subtle, like the faint hum of electricity running through wires buried deep beneath the earth. The Halberts were gone, but their legacy refused to be erased entirely. Sarah's voice broke as she spoke the final words of the incantation, her tears mingling with the rain-soaked ground. I acknowledge your pain, I honor your suffering, and I release you. The mirror before her shimmered, reflecting not just her face but countless others, faces twisted in anguish, eyes hollow yet aware. For a moment, time seemed to freeze, and then with a deafening roar, the vortex collapsed inward, consuming the shadows, the whispers, and the spirits in a blinding flash of green light. The mirror shattered, its shards scattering across the ground like fallen stars. When the light faded, the air vibrated with energy, then stilled, leaving an overwhelming silence in its wake. Sarah collapsed onto her knees, her breath ragged, her heart pounding. She looked around, half expecting Lydia or Ezekiel to materialize one last time, but the estate was empty, truly empty, for the first time in decades. The oppressive atmosphere was gone, replaced by an almost unnatural calm. Even the wind seemed softer, gentler, as if the land itself were exhaling after holding its breath for so long. Daniel approached cautiously, his lantern casting a warm glow against the damp ruins. He knelt beside Sarah, placing a hand on her shoulder. It's over, he said softly, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty. They both knew better than to believe it completely. Some legacies, no matter how thoroughly dismantled, leave traces too stubborn to vanish entirely. In the days that followed, Sarah documented everything meticulously. Every detail of the ritual, every fragment of history uncovered, every whispered warning from the spirits. It all went into a comprehensive record intended to serve as both a testament and a cautionary tale. She published her findings under a pseudonym, careful to obscure identifying details about Hollow Hill and the Halberts while preserving the core truths of their story. Her goal was clear: to ensure that future generations would understand the dangers of tampering with forces beyond comprehension, without inviting reckless curiosity. Yet despite her efforts to move on, Sarah found herself haunted, not by the spirits this time, but by memories. Shadows still lingered at the edges of her vision, faint echoes of the rituals she had performed and the lives she had touched. The symbols etched into her skin had faded to faint scars, but they throbbed occasionally, as if reminding her of the bond she had severed. She understood now what Ezekiel, Caleb, and Thomas had sought, not just power but eternity. Through fear, devotion, and blood, they had woven themselves into the fabric of existence, ensuring their influence would persist long after their physical bodies decayed. And though Sarah had broken the nexus, fragments of their legacy remained, embedded within her. One evening, as she sat alone in her apartment staring at the photographs and sketches spread across her desk, Sarah realized the truth. She could never fully escape the Halberts. Their story was part of her now, written into her very soul. She had become a living archive, a vessel carrying the weight of their sins and secrets. The thought terrified her, but it also brought a strange sense of clarity. If she couldn't sever the connection entirely, then perhaps her role was to bear witness, to keep the memory alive not as a curse but as a lesson. Months later, Sarah returned to Hollow Hill one last time. The estate had been reclaimed by nature, its walls crumbling further, its grounds overrun with weeds and wildflowers. Birds chirped in the trees, and sunlight filtered through the clouds, casting golden beams across the landscape. It was peaceful, far cry from the sinister aura that had once permeated the hill. Yet, as Sarah walked among the ruins, she noticed something unusual. A faint vibration beneath her feet, similar to the one she had felt on her first visit. Curious, she knelt and brushed away the dirt, revealing a small, weathered stone engraved with a single symbol, one she recognized from the blackened book. It pulsed faintly, glowing red in response to her touch. A chill ran down her spine as realization dawned. The halbert's influence hadn't disappeared. It had merely shifted. What remained wasn't malevolence but memory, the collective consciousness of those who had lived, died, and suffered under the family's obsession. The spirits were free, yes, but their stories endured, etched into the soil, the stones, and the roots of the hill itself. Sarah traced the symbol with her fingers, her mind flooded with images. Ezekiel's fervent prayers, Lydia's tear-streaked face, the jars lining the cellar walls, the faces of countless victims. She understood then that the halbert's true power lay not in their rituals, but in their ability to bind memory to place. Hollow Hill would always remember, just as Sarah would always remember. And perhaps that was enough. As Sarah left the hill for the final time, she paused at the edge of the property, glancing back at the ruins. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. For a moment, she thought she saw movement, a figure standing near the remains of the farmhouse watching her silently. But when she blinked, it was gone, leaving only the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a barn owl. She drove home in silence, her thoughts heavy with reflection. Had she truly ended the halbert's curse, or had she merely redirected it? The answer eluded her, but one thing was certain. Some doors once opened could never be fully closed. The echoes of Hollow Hill would linger, not as threats but as reminders, of the fragility of life, the persistence of memory, and the cost of obsession. Back in her apartment, Sarah placed the photographs, notes, and artifacts into a box, sealing it shut. She wrote a single phrase on the lid: "Blood calls to blood." Then she pushed the box into the darkest corner of her closet, resolving to let the past rest where it belonged. But as she turned off the lights and climbed into bed, she couldn't ignore the faint hum beneath her skin, the whisper of a legacy that refused to fade. The end.